He found her huddled beside her dead mother in the wreckage, blue skin stark against the snow. Her obsidian eyes held a story of captivity and a desperate longing for home. This exiled survivor faced a choice: leave her to die or risk everything to cross the deadliest mountain pass in winter. Adam was checking his snares when a metallic glint caught his eye. It flashed again from a drift 200 yards uphill. Nothing metallic should be there. He moved toward it, his carbine held ready. He approached the crash site from the downwind side. The snow muted his steps. His eyes scanned for movement, for heat signatures, for the signs of scavengers or traps. He had learned the hard way that wreckage draws more than just the curious. The air smelled of ozone and cold stone. Nothing moved. The wreckage was not human. The curves of the broken hull were too smooth, flowing into each other without seams. No sharp angles, no visible rivets or welds. The exposed inner surfaces showed layered materials he couldn't identify, some crystalline, some like dense polymer. The craft gave off no heat, no hum of failing systems, just a deep, unnerving silence. Inside the main fracture, he found them. Two figures. One was an adult female, clearly gone. The other was a child, curled tight against her. Both had skin the pale blue of a winter twilight. Their hair was white as the snow around them. The child's eyes were open, black pools watching him. He knelt beside the adult. Her body was broken from the impact, but the marks on her wrists were older. Thick bands of scar tissue circled her thin arms. More scars, just as healed, marked her ankles. These were not from the crash. He knew these patterns. They were restraint scars, the kind that came from bindings worn too long and too tight. He had seen these before on other worlds, in the dark holds of slaver ships. He had carried similar marks himself once, though his had faded long ago. This changed everything. This wasn't an exploration pod that had strayed off course. This was a transport. Its purpose was written on the woman's limbs. The child should not have lived. The cold alone should have claimed her hours ago. The impact should have broken her small body. Yet she breathed, shallow and steady. Her dark eyes tracked his every movement. She showed no fear, only a deep and weary assessment. Adam stood over them, the wind biting at his exposed skin. His exile was built on isolation. Don't get involved. Don't leave traces. Don't look back. The rules were simple because survival was simpler alone, but the child's gaze held him. The scars on the dead woman's wrists mirrored memories he tried to keep buried. He was not just looking at aliens. He was looking at a reflection of his own stolen past. The wall around his instincts began to crack. Adam knelt before the child, keeping his movements slow. Her dark eyes watched him without blinking. They did not hold the vacant stare of a traumatized child. He saw calculation there, an old and weary intelligence. Her small face showed no tears, only a sharp focus that assessed him as a potential threat or a possible tool. She was afraid, but her fear was controlled, channeled. She held her broken arm carefully against her chest, but did not whimper. She made no sound, not even a sharp intake of breath. Her silence felt deliberate, trained. Instead of speaking, she raised her good hand. Her fingers moved with a deliberate precision that demanded attention. She pointed past his shoulder, toward the jagged line of the ice ridge dominating the western horizon. She did not gesture vaguely. She pointed with insistence, her finger tracing a specific path up the distant slopes, then stabbed the air to emphasize the direction. Home was that way. He placed a piece of compressed nutrient bar on a clean patch of snow between them. She ignored it. Instead, she used one finger to sweep a clear space in the frost. She began to draw. Her lines were not the random scribbles of a child. She etched patterns that resolved into recognizable shapes, a series of connected peaks, a winding pass between them. A scattering of dots above that might have been stars. She pointed from the drawing to the actual mountain, then back to her sketch. The correlation was clear. His eyes dropped from the snow drawing to the intricate patterns woven into the fabric of her tunic. He had assumed they were mere decoration, abstract cultural art. Now he looked closer. The swirls and lines were not random. They formed a coherent topographic map. The same peaks she had drawn in the snow were there, rendered in thread. Thin silver lines indicated possible routes. Areas of deep blue stitching marked zones of obvious danger. This was not clothing. It was a functional navigation chart. She saw his understanding. With her good arm, she smoothed the fabric over her knee, pointing to specific symbols. A zigzag pattern likely meant avalanche risk. A cluster of diamond shapes might indicate stable shelter or caves. She then pointed again toward the mountain, her gaze locking with his. She knew exactly where she was, and more importantly, she knew how to get where she was going. Her broken arm was a severe handicap, but it did not hamper her ability to show the way. Adam had seen military specialists with worse situational awareness. This was no ordinary child who had been a passenger. She had not just been carried along. The scars on her mother suggested a long captivity. This child's knowledge implied she had been a valuable asset, a reason for the transport. She had been studying the terrain even as a prisoner, memorizing escape routes, plotting a way home. Her silence was a practiced defense. Her gestures were the language of someone who had learned to communicate without giving away their position. She was a navigator, and she had just given him their heading. He examined the child's clothing for its practical value. The fabric was thin but surprisingly insulating, holding her body heat even in the deep cold. His first thought was to reinforce it, to add layers from his own kit. But as his fingers traced the seams, his focus shifted. The intricate patterns woven into the sleeves and chest were not what he had first assumed. At a distance, they had looked like simple decoration. Cultural flourishes, up close under his careful scrutiny, they resolved into something else entirely. The swirls and geometric shapes were not random. They formed a coherent and detailed topographic map of the surrounding mountain range. The line work was precise, almost technical in its execution. The stitch patterns were a language unto themselves. A dense cross-hatched area on the left shoulder perfectly matched a known avalanche chute he avoided on his own patrols. A smooth, unbroken line of silver thread traced what he recognized as the only stable ridgeline for miles. Zigzag patterns warned of crevasses. Tight clusters of knots indicated potential shelter sites. Hollows under rock overhangs that even he had needed weeks to find. The colors held meaning too. Pale blue thread marked zones of severe cold and high wind exposure. Dark green indicated older, more stable ice. A thin line of gold followed a route that seemed improbable, but, the more he studied it, appeared to be the safest ascent. Along the garment's collar, a circular pattern of white dots on a black field caught his eye. He tilted his head, comparing it to the sky just beginning to show the first stars. The pattern was not a perfect match for the constellations visible from this world. It was something else. It was a star chart for a different season, or perhaps for a different hemisphere entirely, a guide for a long journey from another place. Most compelling was a large design centered on the back of the tunic. It showed the soaring ice ridge they faced, rendered in stark white and gray thread. But on the other side of the ridge, the weaver had used a vibrant spectrum of colors. Shades of emerald, ochre, and deep blue depicted a lush, sheltered valley. It showed cultivated fields in geometric patterns and low structures that blended into the terrain. This was not a mythical promised land. It was drawn with the specifics of a real place, a destination. The mapping was far too precise to be merely symbolic or artistic. It contained information that would take a survey team months to compile. The accuracy of the avalanche zones alone confirmed it was based on real observed data. This was a functional piece of survival equipment. The garment was a guide, its intelligence woven directly into its fabric. It was a testament to a culture that prepared its people, even its children, for the worst. The resolution was absolute. The clothing did not just suggest a homeland might exist. It confirmed its location and provided the means to reach it. The valley was real. The path was charted. The journey was no longer a desperate gamble into the unknown. It was a navigational problem with a known solution, and the key was stitched into the very clothes the child wore. Her people were out there, and they had left a map for her to find them. Adam stood over the dead woman. His shovel was in his hand. He had begun digging a shallow grave in the frozen earth, a task his exile's code demanded. Leave no traces. Do not interfere. Do not let anything lead back to your position. The code was simple because it kept him alive. It was a wall he had built against the world. The child watched him. She had not moved from her mother's side. Her dark eyes were fixed on him, not on the body. Her gaze was a physical weight. It was not a plea. It was an assessment. It measured the distance between his actions and his character. His instincts told him to finish the burial, leave the food and the map, and walk away. The mountains were a death sentence for two. For a man and a wounded child, it was suicide. The storm clouds massing on the horizon would seal their fate within hours. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwanted. Commander Corvin's face, calm and reasonable, explaining why the outpost had to be sacrificed. The math of war. The greater good. Adam had followed orders. He had pulled back, leaving the frontier villagers to their fate. He had carried the weight of their silent accusations for 3 years. The sound of their gates closing, locking them in with the raiders, still echoed on quiet nights. He had survived by being pragmatic, by not looking back. Digging this grave felt different. It was not just disposal, it was an act of respect for a life lost. It was something he could not do for the people he had failed. This woman had died a prisoner, far from her home, her body marked by servitude. To leave her exposed to scavengers felt like a final insult. It felt like obeying Corvin all over again. The child's silence was a judgment. He was being weighed. Her intelligence was evident in every look, every gesture. She was not a simple burden. She was a witness to the choice he made here. Survival calculus said run. His provisions were limited. His knowledge of the terrain was human, incomplete. Her map was alien, untested. The risk was immense. The wind picked up, carrying the first crystals of driven snow. They stung his face. The storm would be a killer. It would erase the crash site. It would erase them if they stayed. His internal calculations warred. A collision of cold logic and something deeper. Something he had buried along with his past. The numbers all pointed one way, but the child's eyes pointed another. He looked from the gathering storm to the small blue face watching him. He looked at the half-dug grave, then at the woman's scarred wrists. This was not about math. It was not about survival odds. It was about the kind of man he had been before the exile, and the kind of man he had become. It was about not failing someone who had already been failed by the universe. He drove the shovel into the ground and left it there. The decision was made. He would not finish the grave. They had to move now. He turned to the child and gave a single, slow nod. He was not leaving her. He was committing to the mountain. He was committing to her. The protector he had once been stirred awake, shrugging off the dust of 3 long years. The survivor was stepping aside. The light failed quickly. The wind began to moan through the rocks, a low sound that promised worse to come. Adam found a shallow overhang in a granite outcrop. It wasn't a cave, but it broke the wind. He used his thermal blanket and a section of the ship's torn insulation to create a lean-to. The space was tight, just enough for the 2 of them to sit close. The entrance was narrow, a design to trap their heat inside. He finished the structure and turned to the child. She stood a few feet away, watching him secure the last corner. Her good arm was wrapped around her body. Her shivering was more pronounced now as the temperature dropped. He gestured for her to enter the shelter. She did not move. Her dark eyes scanned the small dark space, then fixed on him. Confinement with a stranger was its own kind of danger. Her hesitation was absolute. A wall of mistrust as solid as the rock behind her. He understood. He backed away from the shelter entrance, giving her space. Her broken arm was the immediate problem. The cold would seep into the injury, making the pain sharper, risking frostbite. He needed to stabilize it. He turned to the wreckage, searching for something usable. He found a length of slender, flexible tubing from a broken console, and a roll of a silvery, self-adhering tape. The materials were alien, but their purpose was clear. He held them up for her to see. He mimed wrapping his own forearm, then pointed to her injury. She watched, her head tilted. He approached slowly and placed the materials on the ground between them. He retreated again. She looked from the supplies to his face. After a long moment, she gave a single, shallow nod. He moved in and worked quickly. His hands were careful. The splint was firm but not tight. She winced once but made no sound. Next was food. He took a piece of his high-calorie ration bar. It was dense and brown, unappealing but functional. He broke off a small piece and placed it on a clean bit of packaging. He set it near her. She studied it, then him. She leaned forward and smelled it. Her nose wrinkled slightly, but after another assessing look, she picked it up and took a small bite. She chewed slowly, her gaze never leaving him. She finished the piece and did not ask for more. The acceptance was a small breach in her defenses. The wind howled outside, shaking the makeshift shelter. A fine dusting of snow blew in through a gap. He pointed at the entrance, then made a shivering motion, hugging himself. Danger. cold. She watched, then pointed at the roof where the wind struck the blanket. She made a tearing motion with her fingers, then pointed at a rock he had used as an anchor, a suggestion for reinforcement. He adjusted the rock, securing the edge better. The flapping sound lessened. He pointed to his eyes, then swept his hand toward the world outside the shelter. Watch. Look. She nodded. She pointed to her ears, then cupped a hand behind one. Listen. They were building a language. It was crude but functional. Needs and dangers. Directions and warnings. Her shivering had lessened. The shared body heat in the confined space was working. The splint was protecting her arm from the worst of the cold. She sat with her back against the rock wall, her knees drawn up. Her watchfulness remained, but the sharp edge of panic was gone. She was still assessing him, but now as a partner in survival, not just a threat. They had shared a space. They had shared food. They had solved a problem together. The foundation was laid. It was fragile, but it was there. He found it as he lifted the woman's body to carry her to the shallow grave. The crystalline pendant swung free from a slender cord around her neck. It was the size of his thumb, multifaceted and clear. It caught the weak light and held it, then released it as a faint internal glow. It pulsed once, a soft blue light that emanated from deep within the stone. He had never seen a power source or a light that worked that way. It was utterly silent. There was no heat, no hum. Just the light. He held it in his palm. The structure was not like any gemstone he knew. It felt cool and smooth, but the facets were too perfect, arranged in complex geometric patterns that suggested intent, not natural formation. The material was neither glass nor crystal as he understood them. It had a density and a clarity that spoke of advanced fabrication, a materials science far beyond human capability. It was clearly decorative, a piece of personal ornamentation, but its inherent glow marked it as something more. It was a tool, a device. Its purpose was a mystery. The child saw it. Her reaction was immediate and intense. She had been sitting quietly, but she pushed herself up, her good arm reaching out. Her dark eyes were wide, fixed on the pendant. She made a series of urgent gestures. She pointed to the pendant, then to her own chest over her heart. She then mimed placing it against his own chest, then against her broken arm. She repeated the motion of placing it on an injury, her expression showing a clear lessening of pain. Healing. She was telling him it was for healing. He looked from her gestures back to the pendant. He turned it over in his hand. The patterns etched into its largest facet were not random. They were the same patterns he had seen woven into her clothing. The same topographic lines, the same constellations, the same warning symbols for avalanche and crevasse. The connection was deliberate. This pendant was a key part of the same navigational and survival system. It was not just a map to read. It was a tool to use on the journey. His mind raced through the implications. A device that could heal. A people who embedded survival intelligence into their artifacts. This was a technology that slavers would kill for. It was a technology a desperate exile might use. It was more than a trinket. It was a piece of her heritage, a direct link to the civilization that had created the maps on her clothes. Understanding it might be the key to understanding her, and to surviving what came next. He looked at the woman, then at the shallow depression in the earth. The exile's code said to leave no traces, bury everything. But this was not his to bury. This belonged to the living. This was for the child. To enter it would be to discard a potential lifeline, and to sever a connection to her past. It felt wrong. It felt like another kind of theft. He made his decision. He slipped the cord over his own head, tucking the pendant inside his thermal layers. It rested cold against his skin for a moment, then seemed to warm to his body heat. He would keep it for her. It was not his. He was its guardian. The child watched him do it. Her reaching hand relaxed. She gave a single slow nod. The frantic energy left her. She understood. He was not taking it. He was holding it in trust. The object became more than a tool. It became their first shared secret, a physical token of the bond forming between them, a promise sealed not with words but with a silent understanding over a piece of glowing crystal. It was a connection to her mother that would not be left in the frozen ground. His fingers brushed against something else in the frozen debris near the woman's body. It was the same material as the pendant, a blade. It was no longer than his forearm, single-edged. and seemed to be made from one solid piece of that clear, glowing crystal. It had no hilt, no guard, no pommel, just a smooth, rounded grip area that flowed into the sharpened blade. It looked more like a shard of ice than a forged tool. He picked it up. It was cold, but not painfully so. The violence of the crash had shattered the ship's hull and broken bodies. Yet the blade's edge was perfect. He tested it with his thumb. It was lethally sharp. He took his own carbon steel survival knife and drew the crystal edge across it. His knife's edge notched. The crystal showed no mark. It had cut through hardened steel. He tried it on a twisted piece of the wreck's framing. The blade slid through the strange alloy with a faint sizzling sound, leaving a clean, molten-looking edge. His tools were obsolete. This blade could cut anything they might encounter. The balance was all wrong. The weight was distributed in a way that felt alien in his hand. It was not front-heavy like a hatchet or hilt-heavy like a sword. The center of mass seemed to shift slightly as he moved it, as if the blade itself was making tiny adjustments. It felt less like holding a tool and more like his hand was being guided. The sensation was unsettling but also precise. It was perfectly balanced for its own unique purpose, a purpose he did not yet understand. The child watched him. She saw his awkward grip. She stepped closer. With her good hand, she reached out and adjusted his fingers on the smooth grip. She positioned them not for a slashing cut, but for a precise pulling motion. She then pointed to a thick cable hanging from a torn console. She mimed the pulling motion. He tried it. The blade went through the cable with no resistance. She then showed him a different grip, a stabbing hold. She pointed to a seam in the wreckage. He pressed the point into the seam. The blade seemed to vibrate for a second, then sank deep into the material, prying it apart with ease. She was teaching him its functions. He realized the blade responded to pressure. A light touch gave it a fine edge for detail work, for cutting cord or cleaning game. A firm, committed pressure made it bite deep for cutting wood or prying metal. The blade itself seemed to alter its cutting properties based on how it was used. It was not a dumb piece of sharp rock. It was an intelligent instrument responding to the user's intent. This was not a weapon. It was a multi-purpose survival tool. A knife, a saw, a pry bar, a chisel. It was the one tool a castaway would need above all others. It was a masterpiece of design and material science. His people carried a kit of a dozen specialized tools. Her people carried one, and it was better than all of his combined. The implications settled on him. This technology was not just different. It was generations ahead of anything humans had. The slavers hadn't just been transporting laborers. They had been stealing knowledge. They had been capturing a civilization's greatest assets. This tool could mean the difference between life and death on the ice. Where his equipment would fail, this would not. It was a key to the mountain. The blade ceased to be a found object. It became essential equipment. He fashioned a simple sheath for it from a piece of the ship's insulation, securing it to his belt. It was no longer a curiosity. It was a statement. Her people's knowledge was not theoretical. It was practical, powerful, and it was now in his hand. It was their best chance. A shape resolved itself from the blowing snow. It was low to the ground, moving with a fluid grace that defied the howling wind. Its fur was the exact blue-white of the ice fields, making it a ghost, a part of the storm itself. It was a snow leopard, but unlike any he'd tracked. Larger. Its eyes were pools of liquid silver. Adam's hand went to the crystal blade on his belt. His muscles coiled. He positioned his body between the predator and the child. He expected the low growl, the flattened ears, the charge. This was the peak predator of this range. An encounter always ended in blood. The child did not cower behind him. She stepped around his protective stance. She moved toward the leopard. Her movement was not fearful or aggressive. It was purposeful. Adam's breath caught. He tightened his grip on the blade, ready to lunge. The leopard's head swung toward her, its silver eyes narrowing. It was a ton of muscle and instinct, and she was walking right into its strike zone. She stopped a few paces from the creature. She made a sound. It was not a word. It was a series of soft musical notes, a gentle vocalization that rose and fell. It was utterly alien. The leopard's ears, which had been laid flat, twitched forward. The tension in its shoulders seemed to ease. It didn't growl. It made a low rumbling sound deep in its chest. It was not a threat. It was a response. Her hands began to move. She held her good arm out, palm down, fingers relaxed. She moved it slowly in an arc, mirroring the slow, cautious swish of the leopard's tail. Her gestures were a direct reflection of the animal's own body language. She was not commanding it. She was communicating with it, speaking a language of posture and sound that transcended species. Adam watched, his grip on the blade loosening. This was not a standoff. It was a conversation. The leopard took a step closer, its massive head dipping to sniff her outstretched fingers. The rumble in its chest grew louder, a contented sound. It was clear this was not a random act. This was a practiced interaction. The child knew this creature, or at least knew its kind. Her people had a relationship with the native fauna that went far beyond hunter and prey. This was symbiosis. This leopard was not random wildlife drawn by the scent of blood or weakness. Its arrival felt intentional. Its appearance in the heart of the storm felt like more than coincidence. It was a potential ally, a native guide. Adam's own tracking skills were human, learned through trial and error. This creature's senses were innate, honed by generations to read the mountain's every secret. It could smell a storm hours away. It could sense unstable snow under its paws long before it cracked. It could find game where he saw only barren ice. The dynamic of their journey shifted in that moment. It was no longer a man and a child against the mountain. The leopard's arrival transformed their survival odds from impossible to merely desperate. They were no longer a pair. They were a trio. The group now had a scout, a protector, and a native guide rolled into one 400-pound package of primal instinct. The child had not just found a way home on a map. She had found them a key to navigating the deadly path itself. The leopard did not leave. It followed them at a distance of about 50 yards, a blue-white shadow moving parallel to their path. It matched their pace, stopping when they stopped, its silver eyes always watching. Adam kept one hand near the crystal blade. Trusting a predator went against every instinct honed by 3 years of solitude. His exile was built on self-reliance and a deep suspicion of anything that could turn from a resource into a threat. This creature was the apex threat of this mountain. Its loyalty, if it had any, was to the child, not to him. He was a variable in its equation. The child saw his tension. She would stop and gesture toward the leopard, then point to Adam, then make a sweeping motion of peace with her good hand. Her expression was firm, insistent. She was not asking. She was explaining. The leopard was part of this. She then demonstrated. She made a soft warbling call, almost a bird-like trill. The leopard's ears pricked up. It took 2 steps closer. She made a different sound, a low clicking in her throat. The leopard immediately sat on its haunches. It was not trained. It was communicating. It understood specific vocal commands. The creature's value became apparent within the first hour of travel. They were approaching a wide, snow-covered slope that looked stable to Adam. The leopard halted. It did not follow them onto the field. It remained on the rocky outcrop at the edge, making a low, grating sound deep in its chest. It pawed at the rock, refusing to step onto the snow. Adam paused. The child tugged his sleeve, pointing back to the leopard, then shaking her head vigorously. Danger. He studied the snowfield again. He saw what he had missed. A faint, almost imperceptible depression ran across the entire slope. A fracture line, an avalanche waiting for the right trigger. The leopard had sensed the instability they could not see. It happened again with the weather. The sky was a uniform gray, giving no indication of change. The leopard lifted its head, sniffing the air. It let out a short, sharp bark and began trotting toward a cluster of large boulders. It looked back at them, clearly expecting them to follow. Minutes later, the wind shifted and the temperature plummeted. A wall of white descended on the mountain, a sudden, intense squall. They were already sheltered in the lee of the rocks. The leopard curled up beside them, its large body blocking the worst of the wind. It had known the storm was coming long before their human senses could detect it. Adam's exile mindset warred with the evidence. His survival had always been a solitary calculation of risk and reward. Accepting help, especially from a non-human source, felt like a vulnerability. It felt like losing control. But the leopard was not a passive beneficiary. It hunted. On the second day, game was scarce. Adam's snares were empty. The leopard disappeared for an hour and returned, dragging the carcass of a large, goat-like animal. It dropped the kill near them and retreated to a respectful distance. It had provided. It was contributing to the group's survival. Their travel speed improved dramatically. The leopard's knowledge of the terrain was innate. It found paths through rockfalls that were invisible to Adam, routes that saved them hours of difficult climbing. It knew where the snow was firmest underfoot, where the ice was thickest over streams. It was a native guide in the truest sense. Adam stopped calculating their progress based solely on his own maps and started watching the leopard for cues. The trio settled into a rhythm. Adam provided the brute strength for cutting steps in ice and building shelters. The child provided the navigational intelligence from her clothing and the silent coordination with their guide. The leopard provided the advanced warning system, the hunting prowess, and the intimate knowledge of the mountain itself. They were no longer a man escorting a child with a dangerous animal following them. They were a single, coordinated survival unit. Each member had a role. Each role was essential. The alliance was no longer unlikely. It was the only reason they were still alive. The ice ridge rose before them, a sheer wall of wind-scoured blue. It was the most direct route through the range, a brutal ascent he had scouted months ago. It was the path his own experience dictated. Time was the enemy. Every hour brought deeper cold, weaker light. Adam studied the face, picking out the line he would take. A series of narrow ledges, a treacherous traverse across a snowfield, then a final climb to the summit. It was dangerous, but it was fast. It was the kind of risk his exile's life was built on. He adjusted the pack on his shoulders and pointed upward. The child's hand gripped his arm. She shook her head, her dark eyes serious. She pointed not up, but to the south along the base of the cliff. She traced a long, winding path with her finger that disappeared behind a massive outcrop of rock. The route was not visible from their position. It was a guess, a gamble. He shook his head, pointing again to the direct climb. The math was simple. Shorter distance, less exposure to the elements. Her insistence grew. She pulled at his sleeve, her small face set with a certainty that belied her years. She dropped to one knee in the snow, ignoring the cold. With her good hand, she swept a patch clear. She began to draw. Her lines were not the map from her clothing now. They were specific to this moment. She sketched the direct route he had chosen. Then, with a series of sharp, jagged lines, she cross-hatched the snowfield he planned to traverse. She pointed to the drawing, then to the actual slope above them. She made a motion with her hands of the ground giving way, of a wall of white crashing down. Avalanche risk. Extreme risk. Then she drew the longer route. It snaked away, following the base of the ridge for nearly a mile before beginning a much gentler, switchbacking ascent up a different face. She indicated stable rock for most of the climb. The angle was less severe. The snow coverage was thinner there, according to the patterns on her sleeve. The danger was not the terrain on this path. The danger was the distance. It would take them most of a day longer. It would cost them precious calories. It would force them to spend another night on the mountain in the open. His human experience argued against it. He knew this ridge. He had seen winter storms erase paths like the one she suggested, turning gentle slopes into impassable walls of drift. The direct route was a known quantity, a calculated risk. Her knowledge was alien, theoretical. It was lines on a piece of clothing. It was a child's drawing in the snow. To trust it was to bet their lives on symbols he did not fully understand. He looked from her determined face to the looming ice wall. The wind pulled at his hood. The leopard sat watching them, its silver eyes blinking slowly. It had trusted her instincts over his before. It had been right. Time was their enemy, but a buried corpse had no schedule to keep. The longer path offered a chance. The direct route offered a probability of death. He made the choice. He nodded to her, then gestured toward the southern path. He would follow her guidance. He was not just trusting a child. He was trusting the accumulated survival intelligence of her people, woven into her clothes and etched into her memory. His role shifted in that moment. He was no longer the sole navigator. He was the strength following a new map. He was the protector of a wisdom greater than his own. The climb would be longer, but the odds of reaching the top alive had just improved. The leopard's warning growl was a low rumble that was swallowed by the wind. It came a second too late. They were halfway across a wide span of snow that arched between two rock faces. It looked solid, a stable bridge they had all trusted. The leopard took one more step. The ice gave way with a sound like cracking bone. A section the size of a large table vanished beneath the creature's weight. It made no sound as it fell, just disappeared into the blue-shadowed darkness of a hidden crevasse. A sickening snap echoed up from the void, followed by a pained, stifled whine. The child moved before Adam did. She dropped her small pack and was pulling out the coiled rope. Her hands worked with a speed and certainty that bypassed thought. She was not panicking. She was executing a procedure. She found a solid rock outcrop and began tying the rope around it with complex interlocking knots. Her fingers flew, pulling the lines tight with a sharp tug after each loop. She was building an anchor point for a rescue. Adam's mind raced through the options. Leave it, the exile's code was clear. A broken leg was a death sentence here. The risk of a rescue was immense. The crevasse could widen. The ropes could fail. The leopard in its agony could turn on them. He looked at the child. Her face was set, her focus absolute on the knots. She believed this was possible. She believed the leopard was worth the risk. The creature had saved them more than once. It had provided food. It had warned of storms. It was part of their unit. To leave it was to abandon an ally. It was to go back to being just a man and a child against the mountain. He made the choice. They would try. He took the end of the rope from her and tied it around his own waist, using a knot he knew would hold. He fashioned a makeshift harness. He looked at the child and pointed to the crystal blade he left on the ground beside her. He made a cutting motion across the rope, then pointed down into the crevasse, then made a running motion away. His instruction was clear. If the leopard turned aggressive or if the ice started to give way more, she was to cut the rope and run. She nodded, her dark eyes serious. She understood the stakes. He began the descent. The walls of the crevasse were sheer blue ice that glowed with a deep, cold light. The air grew still and much colder. The leopard lay about 20 feet down on a narrow ledge of snow that had caught its fall. It was panting, its breath misting in the dim light. Its front leg was bent at a wrong angle. The bone had snapped cleanly. It watched him come down, its silver eyes wide with pain, but it did not snarl. It made a low, trembling sound. He reached the ledge. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible. He spoke in a low, calm tone, though he knew it couldn't understand the words. The leopard remained still, its trust in the child seemingly extending to him in this moment of crisis. He examined the leg. The break was bad. He had no proper medical supplies. He used the crystal blade to cut 2 straight, strong pieces of wood from a supply in his pack. He then cut long strips from his thermal undershirt. He fashioned a splint, binding the wood firmly above and below the break. The leopard flinched but did not pull away. Getting it out was the hard part. He used more of the rope to create a crude harness around the leopard's chest and shoulders. He secured it with more of the child's expert knots. He signaled to the child above. She began to pull, using the rock outcrop as a pulley. Adam pushed from below, guiding the heavy, injured animal up the icy wall. It was a slow, brutal process. The leopard remained remarkably passive, its trust absolute. They got it onto solid ground. The leopard lay panting, the splint stark against its blue-white fur. The immediate crisis was over. The child knelt beside it, her small hand resting on its head. It nuzzled her palm. The rescue had taken hours and cost them most of their remaining daylight. But the cost was irrelevant. The successful pull from the icy darkness did more than save their guide. It cemented something. They were no longer 3 individuals thrown together by chance. They were a pack. They had faced a shared danger and had not broken. The bond was sealed in the cold dark of the crevasse, tested and proven. The leopard panted on the frozen ground, its broken leg held stiff and awkward. The pain was clear in its tight muscles and the low whine in its breath. The child knelt beside it, the crystalline pendant in her good hand. She held it above the splint. It began to glow. The faint internal light he had seen before intensified, becoming a steady pulsing blue that illuminated the snow around them. She held it steady, her small face set with concentration. Adam watched. The light from the pendant seemed to seep into the leopard's fur, not as heat but as a visible energy. He saw the muscles around the injury begin to relax. The tension of pain left the animal's body. The panting slowed, becoming deeper, more regular. The leopard's head, which had been lifted in distress, settled onto the ground. Its eyes, which had been wide with agony, half closed. The change was visible within minutes. The creature was not just sedated. It was healing. He had seen advanced field med kits. Stimpaks could numb a wound. Biofoam could seal it. Nothing in his experience worked this fast or this completely. This was not first aid. This was an acceleration of the body's own processes. He estimated the bone was a clean break, but still, the speed of the response was impossible. Her people did not just have better technology, They had redefined the relationship between biology and medicine. This was a fundamental leap. The child noticed his intense observation. She moved the pendant over her own broken arm, which was still splinted. The device glowed with the same blue light. She then pointed the crystal at his chest, then back at her arm. She made a scanning motion. Her meaning was clear. The pendant could diagnose as well as heal. It could assess injury, identify the problem, and then apply its energy to fix it. It was a complete medical system, contained in an object the size of his thumb. It was a hospital in the palm of her hand. This was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was advanced biotechnology of the highest order. The implications crashed into him. Healing at this speed and efficiency would be invaluable on a battlefield. It would be priceless to any military. It would be worth a fortune to slavers running dangerous operations where injuries were common. It was a tool that could keep a labor force alive and working under brutal conditions. He understood now why they had been taken. They weren't just laborers. They were carriers of technology. The mother had been killed protecting this secret. The pendant represented a profound duality. It was their greatest hope. It could heal their injuries. It could get them through the mountain. But it was also their greatest danger. Its existence was the reason for their captivity. If anyone else discovered its power, the hunt for them would never end. It was a key to life and a beacon for death. The resolution was absolute. The device's power was no longer theoretical. Seeing the leopard's pain vanish, watching the biological process accelerate before his eyes made it real. The value of the pendant was confirmed. More importantly, the advanced capabilities of her people were proven. They were not a primitive culture. They possessed a science so refined it seemed like magic. This was the civilization they were trying to reach. A society that could create such a thing was worth any risk to find. The journey was no longer just about returning a child. It was about reaching a source of knowledge that could change everything. The leopard's broken leg forced a new strategy. They moved slower, much slower. Every step had to be considered, every footfall tested. The pace was no longer about speed. It was about deliberate, careful progress. Each mile cost them more in time and energy. Their food supply dwindled. The air grew thinner, colder. The wind bit at any exposed skin. The injured leopard set the rhythm. A limping but steady pace they all followed. They climbed with heightened caution. The leopard's senses became their primary defense. It would stop suddenly. Its good front paw lifted, its head cocked. It would stare at a patch of snow that looked no different from any other. It would refuse to move until they found a way around. It detected soft, unstable snow over hidden crevasses. It sensed subtle shifts in the wind that signaled a coming squall long before the clouds appeared. Its instincts were a living map of the mountain's dangers. The child's knowledge from her woven garments provided the framework, the overall route. The leopard's senses filled in the immediate, critical details. Adam was the physical engine. He cut handholds in the steepest ice faces with the crystal blade. He carried the heaviest part of the load. He broke trail through the deepest drifts. He lifted and supported the leopard over the most difficult obstacles. His strength was the tool that executed their shared plan. They developed a rhythm. They moved for an hour. They rested for 10 minutes. They moved again. The pattern became automatic. No words were needed. The child would point. The leopard would lead or halt. Adam would act. They worked as a single organism, each part dependent on the others. The thin air and brutal cold were a constant weight. Adam's breathing became labored, each lungful a conscious effort. The cold seeped into his old injuries, making his joints ache. The child showed a different kind of endurance. The altitude did not seem to affect her breathing. The cold, while uncomfortable, did not cause the same shivering exhaustion it did in him. Her small size was a disadvantage in the wind, but her resilience was remarkable. She never complained. She simply watched, calculated, and pointed the way. Her broken arm, though still splinted, seemed less of a handicap each day. The pendant was their silent partner in the climb. Each evening, the child used it. She would hold it over the leopard's leg. The blue light would pulse and the animal would relax, the pain visibly receding. She would use it on her own arm for a few minutes. She even offered it to Adam once, gesturing toward a deep cut on his hand from a sharp rock. He let her. The cool blue light washed over the wound. The bleeding stopped instantly. The ragged edges of the cut seemed to pull together. The pain vanished. The healing was not immediate, but it was dramatically accelerated. It was like gaining back a little time, a little strength each day. Their progress was a brutal slog. It was a test of will as much as body. The summit seemed to retreat before them. Always another ridge, another climb. The cold was a physical enemy. The wind tried to tear them from the mountain. But their coordination never broke. The child navigated. The leopard warned. Adam climbed. The pendant healed. They were a system, a machine built for one purpose. They reached the summit at dusk on the fourth day. There was no fanfare. They simply crested the final rise and there was no more up. They stood on a wind-scoured plateau of ice and rock. The air was so thin it felt like breathing nothing. The world fell away in every direction. They had done it. Against the cold, the altitude, the injury, and the mountain itself, they had reached the top. It was not a victory of strength alone. It was a victory of a perfect, hard-won partnership. They had become a single entity, and that entity had conquered the ridge. Adam stood on the ice ridge and looked down. He expected to see more of what they had crossed. More endless rock and ice and snow, a frozen hellscape stretching to the horizon. That was the world he knew. That was the world of his exile. The view that met his eyes was something else entirely. A vast valley lay sheltered between the mountain's arms. It was not frozen. It was verdant, lush, alive. The air that rose from it felt different, warmer. It carried the faint, impossible scent of growing things. The valley floor was a patchwork of organized fields. They were not the wild, chaotic patterns of nature. They were geometric, precise. Rows of plants with broad, fan-shaped leaves, clusters of colorful fruits. This was cultivated land, tended land. The structures were not immediately obvious. They blended into the landscape. Low, graceful buildings seemed to grow from the earth itself, their curves matching the contours of the land. They were made of materials that reflected the light softly, not the harsh glare of metal or plasteel. They were designed not to dominate the environment, but to be a part of it. This was not a camp or an outpost. It was a settlement. A home. Figures moved among the fields. Their skin was the same pale blue as the child's. They moved with a deliberate, graceful purpose. Some tended the plants. Others carried baskets. They worked together. This was a community, a functioning society. The child made a sound. It was the first real sound he had heard from her. A soft, choked gasp. He looked down. She was standing beside him, her good hand gripping the fabric of his coat. Her dark eyes were wide, fixed on the valley below. They were not full of wonder. They were full of recognition. This was not a surprise to her. This was a confirmation. Her entire body trembled, not from the cold, but from an emotion so profound it was physical. This was her homeland. She was looking at home. The valley showed a level of development that was startling. This was no primitive tribe clinging to survival. The agricultural pattern spoke of advanced environmental management. The integration of the structures showed a deep understanding of architecture and harmony with nature. They had not just found a refuge from the slavers. They had built a civilization here, a thriving hidden civilization. They had mastered their world. The journey shifted in that moment. The focus sharpened to a single point. It was no longer about surviving the next storm, finding the next meal, or enduring the next mile. The abstract concept of home that had been a line on a map woven into fabric was now real. It was a physical place full of her people, just a descent away. The brutal climb, the injuries, the fear, it all became a prelude. This was the delivery. His purpose collapsed from the vast, impossible task of crossing a mountain to the simple, immediate act of taking her down that slope. He was not just a survivor in the wilderness anymore. He was a guide on the final leg of a long journey. He was delivering her home. They moved down the final slope toward the edge of the settlement. Adam's hand returned to the crystal blade. He expected sentries. He expected a perimeter defense. His mind calculated the angles of approach, the fields of fire, the best cover. He had seen too many first contacts turn violent over a simple misunderstanding. He kept the child slightly behind him. The leopard moved at his other side, its low growl a constant vibration in the air. Figures emerged from the tall, fan-leaved plants. They were not workers. They were scouts. 2 of them. Their skin was the same pale blue. They moved with a fluid silence that was unnerving. They carried weapons. long, slender rods of a dark, polished material that looked both organic and manufactured. They did not aim them. They held them at a low, ready position. Their black eyes assessed the trio. They showed no alarm, no aggression, only a deep, watchful calm. The weapons were a precaution, not a promise of violence. The child stepped out from behind Adam. She moved forward. She raised her good hand. Her fingers began to move. They traced patterns in the air. They were not simple gestures. They were complex, formal signs. They flowed from one to the next with a practiced grace. It was a language. The two scouts watched her hands. Their own hands came up. They began to mirror her movements. Their gestures were slightly different, a response rather than a repetition. A dialogue was happening in complete silence. It was a recognition, a verification. An older man stepped from between two of the low, earth-blended structures. His movements were slower, more deliberate. His face was lined. His dark eyes went first to the child. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze shifted to Adam. The scrutiny was intense. It felt like the man was looking through him, measuring his soul. Adam stood his ground, his own hand still near his blade. The elder looked from Adam to the child, then to the leopard. He took a slow breath. He spoke. The words were human language. They were halting, the syllables thick and accented, as if spoken by a mouth not made for them. "You bring child home," he said. The words were a statement, not a question. "Cross mountains. Save from slavers." The words were simple, but the meaning was vast. They knew. They knew about the human slavers. They knew the reason for the transport. They knew the danger their people faced. Adam's association with humanity was not a point of confusion. It was a point of data. They had categorized him based on his actions, not his species. The tension in Adam's shoulders eased. The scouts lowered their weapons completely. The formal hand gestures ceased. The child looked back at Adam, her expression one of calm assurance. The peaceful reception was not just luck. It was a product of their understanding. They were not a warlike people reacting to an invader. They were victims of a known threat, cautiously welcoming an ally. They saw him not as a human, but as the man who had protected one of their own from a common enemy. The resolution was clear. They were not the threat. They had been living under the threat. His journey had not ended at a new front line. It had ended at a sanctuary. The father of the child stepped away from their embrace. He approached Adam. His movement was slow and deliberate, every step measured. He stopped an arm's length away. The crowd watched in silence. He placed his open hand flat on his own chest. He bowed his head slightly. It was a formal gesture, a ritual. His words came slowly. He shaped them with care, his accent thick, the syllables unfamiliar in his mouth. "My child lives because of you," he said. The words hung in the cold air. He was not stating a fact. He was framing a premise. "You cross mountains. You face cold. You fight death for her." His dark eyes held Adam's, unblinking. The translation was rough, but the meaning was absolute. He continued, his voice gaining a firmer tone. "My house is your house." He gestured toward one of the low, graceful dwellings. "My family is your family." He looked at the people gathered around them, then back at Adam. This was not a casual offer of hospitality. It was a declaration. This is blood debt. The term was heavy, final. It carried the weight of law and honor. It was an obligation that could not be refused or repaid lightly. This was their way. The elder who had first spoken stepped forward. He nodded his agreement. "This is our way," he confirmed. His voice was quieter but no less firm. "You are welcome among us. Home here if you wish." The confirmation from the elder made it official. This was not one man's gratitude. It was a cultural mandate. The entire community was bound by this promise. Adam stood there, the words settling on him. His exile status meant nothing here. Commander Corvin's judgment, the banishment from his own people, the 3 years of solitude, they were irrelevant in this valley. These people did not care where he came from or what he had been. They cared about what he had done. His value was not assigned by a past he could not change. It was earned by his actions on the mountain. He was being judged solely on his character, on the choices he made when no one was watching. They were offering him belonging. Not as a refugee, not as a temporary guest, but as kin. The debt was a bond. It meant protection. It meant a share in their resources. It meant a place at their fires. It was an offer to step out of the wilderness forever. The definition of value he had carried for years was rewritten in that moment. He was no longer an outcast to be avoided, or a survivor to be pitied. He was an honored guest, a man who had done a heroic thing. A protector. The title fit him better than any he had ever held. The resolution was a quiet, seismic shift in his soul. The past was not erased, but it was overpowered by a new and more powerful truth. His actions had built him a new identity. Adam looked at the settlement around him, the organized fields, the low, graceful buildings, the people moving with quiet purpose. He had spent 3 years avoiding any sight like this. Human outposts, colonial hubs. Any gathering meant scrutiny. It meant rules. It meant the chance of seeing another face like Corvin's. His exile was built on isolation. His safety was in empty spaces. This was everything he had trained himself to flee. These people offered a different code. The father's words were not a conditional offer. They were a statement of fact. A blood debt. His house, his family, they were giving him what his own command had ripped away. They valued the very instincts Corvin had called a liability, his drive to protect, his refusal to leave someone behind. His people had exiled him for those traits. These strangers were building him a home because of them. The father gestured toward one of the dwellings. It was not a guest house on the edge of the settlement. It was a home among the others, a place woven into the community. The gesture included the leopard. The massive animal was not seen as a wild beast to be caged or driven off. It was part of their unit. A youth brought a large cut of meat and set it before the creature. It was accepted without question. The leopard was family too. Their bond, forged on the mountain, was recognized and honored here. His body ached from years of old injuries. A bad knee from a fall on the ice. A shoulder that never healed right after a rock slide. The child saw him favor it. She came to him, the pendant in her hand. She held it over the old injury. The familiar blue light glowed. A deep, warm relief spread through the torn muscles and scar tissue. It was not a full healing, but it was more than he had felt in years. Their technology could fix the damage his life had done. They offered not just shelter, but repair. Their society was built on a foundation he understood. Protection. Loyalty. The debt was not a transaction. It was a cultural backbone. Your actions defined your worth. Your loyalty earned you belonging. This was the opposite of Corvin's world. That world ran on birthright and political favors. On who you knew. On what you could take. This place ran on what you would give. On what you would protect. It was a value system that made sense to him. It was the code he had tried to live by alone in the wilderness. The ice ridge was a dark line against the sky. He had seen it as the edge of the world. A barrier between him and everything else. A wall that kept him in his exile. Now he looked at it from the other side. It was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge. It was the path that had led him here. The journey across it had not been an escape. It had been an arrival. Home was not a set of coordinates on a star chart. It was not a planet or a station. It was not a memory of a place he had lost. It was the quiet acceptance of the people around him. It was the father's hand on his chest. It was the child's confident smile. It was the leopard curling up to sleep by his assigned dwelling. It was a community that saw his protective nature not as a flaw, but as its greatest strength. He had crossed the deadliest pass on the continent looking for the child's home. He had found his own. Adam found his redemption in the child others would have left behind. His protection of her became his purpose, each act of care chipping away at his exile's isolation. He earned his place through action alone, carrying her across the deadliest terrain, his worth measured not by birth but by grit and sacrifice. In saving her, he saved himself from a lifetime of solitude. He discovered that true belonging is built, not given, forged in shared struggle and proven loyalty under the harshest conditions. His old life ended on that mountain. His new one began in the valley.